After the police killing of George Floyd last year, the city of Minneapolis took the first steps to potentially limit the size and scope of its police department. It has roots in the activist movement that popularized the defund the police slogan. This November, voters will decide whether to adopt a new amendment to replace the Minneapolis Police Department with a Department of Public Safety. As Politico reports, it is the first ballot test of a big city police department overhaul in advance of the midterm elections. With violent crime rising across the country, it's also a gauge of just how much political capital defund movement activists have left. Minneapolis's incumbent Mayor Jacob Frey is also back on the ballot. The Democrat is facing nearly 20 challengers, some of whom led the protests for police accountability last summer. Maya King joins me now with more. She is a politics reporter for Politico. Maya, welcome. Great to have you with us. How would public safety in Minneapolis change if this amendment were to pass?
Hi, thanks for having me. Well, the approach to public safety that the Yes for Minneapolis amendment would do would essentially, in the eyes of those who have shaped this amendment, replace it with a public health approach to public safety. So instead of relying largely on police officers, law enforcement, to keep the public safe, they would actually incorporate more social workers, mental health experts, and crisis managers to actually deal with a lot of these emergencies. One thing that both activists, those who are proponents of the Yes for Minneapolis ballot amendment, and even many members of law enforcement can agree on is that a lot of times police officers are called in for emergencies that they're not exactly well equipped to handle. When someone is having a mental health emergency, when a family might be dealing with a domestic violence incident, or when there is a crisis in the community that involves a number of members, police are often called and it ends in violence. I guess one of the most violent incidences that we can name in the last year was, in fact, the killing of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. However, with this public health approach measure, as its proponents have laid it out, instead of calling for police officers to actually respond to these emergencies, the public safety aspect of this would be a public health approach with a social worker or a crisis manager, someone who can diffuse the situation, perhaps without resulting immediately to violence.
And of course, we have watched as nationally Democrats have argued about the defund the police movement's impact on the party. That tension is also playing out in Minneapolis. Can you tell us how you're seeing it play out there?
Well, we know that the movement to defund the police has its roots, really its beginnings, in the city of Minneapolis, both because this is where we saw the death of George Floyd, before the death of Jamar Clark, a 24-year-old who was shot and killed by Minneapolis police, and of course, even before that, the shooting death of Philando Castile. So out of all of these incidences, you have this movement among activists and others in this community to figure out ways to limit the power and the influence of law enforcement, which starts with their budgets. The defund the police movement in Minneapolis has divided the city. In many ways, it's divided other cities. A lot of people are torn between saying that police need to be reformed, but feel that defunding the police or taking away a lot of their power might actually be a bridge too far. This is, of course, extremely prevalent, not only in the face of Democrats nationally having this debate, but also the spike in violent crime that's taken place in Minneapolis and other major cities across the country. So it's a microcosm of a lot of what we're seeing, not just on the national stage in Congress, but also just on the local level as a number of municipalities debate the merits of really the value of law enforcement to these communities and how you can put a dollar sign to those and what exactly that means for the communities that they serve.
Right. And so is there any sort of consensus then from those local communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by police violence?
Well, among a number of members of these communities, many say the police need to be reformed, but they don't think that defunding or even abolishing the police is the answer. In Minneapolis specifically, I spoke with Jeremiah Ellison, who is a city council member who represents the 5th Ward of Minneapolis, which is one of its heaviest, predominantly Black wards in the city. And he said that he's had to have one-on-one conversations with a lot of his constituents because while they agree that the police should be reformed, they don't exactly know if they're ready to vote yes on the Second Amendment or the Yes for Minneapolis initiative, because they feel like a Department of Public Safety, a major police overhaul in their city might be too much too soon. And they do agree, again, that reform is important. However, the consensus, I don't think is quite there among members of these communities. Some feel that this is important, but might want to see something a little bit more in the middle that limits the power of police, perhaps to over-police communities of color or to avoid a repeat of what we saw last summer with George Floyd's killing, but believe that a total fundamental shift in how law enforcement operate in cities like Minneapolis is just a little bit more than what they'd like to see happen in the immediate future.
And Maya, you report that a recent crime spike is complicating efforts to sell this amendment to the public. Tell us how that's contributing and what else might be contributing to fears that this movement could eventually fizzle out.
Yeah, you've seen in the last month a number of pretty high-profile politicians who have roots in Minneapolis and Minnesota. Governor Tim Walz, Senator Amy Klobuchar, Mayor Jacob Frey, mayor of Minneapolis, coming out against this this ballot amendment, saying that they feel like in the wake of the recent crime spike, police officers are necessary, and that the one immediate answer to a rise in crime is by not only adding and hiring more law enforcement, but appeasing the members of law enforcement who are in place right now. And so this is something that adds a lot of weight to this conversation. Of course, people are looking at Minneapolis and other cities that are across the country dealing with not only this increase in crime, but this debate around what role law enforcement should play after last summer's protests and this heightened attention to police violence and systemic racism. If members at the very top of the government who are close to Minneapolis and close to Minnesota are saying that the police are really important and integral part of dealing with this crime spike, other cities and other city leaders are inclined to agree. A number of the people that I talked to for this story have made it very clear that Minneapolis and what happens in November in this city stands to be an example for other cities and how they tackle this issue, not only of law enforcement and the role that law enforcement play, but of how they deal with a rise in crime and try to keep their communities safe. And so at the root of this story, not only in Minneapolis, but really across the country, is, again, this approach to public safety and how different cities are willing to define it and how they're willing to maintain it.
And you mentioned Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. He faces not only a dozen plus challengers, but challenging polling. 35% of voters view him favorably, 36% unfavorably. Who is mounting the strongest campaign against him?
So as you mentioned, there are over a dozen, really almost 24 people in Minneapolis who are mounting this challenge to Jacob Frey, who see this election as a referendum in many ways on his leadership, particularly over the last 18 months. However, out of those nearly 20 candidates, 2 have risen to the top. One, Sheila Nezhad, who is a former or current organizer with one of the most prominent organizing groups in the city, and another, Kate Newth, who was a state representative and has a lot of roots in state politics and understanding of how those operate. However, Nezhad, as an activist, has a really direct relationship between the streets and also the government in the city. And so it gets back to this earlier point of whether or not this election will be a referendum on Frey's leadership in the city. And that's why I think you see so many people who have mounted these challenges to him. However, on the debate stage, it has been Frey, Newth, and Nezhad who are vying for this top spot.
Maya King, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.